The evacuation transport sat on the landing pad with its engines warming, and Yaren stood before it with her single bag of personal effects and a decision she had not yet made. Dawn was breaking over Firebase Echo, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for a day that would end in so much death. Sergeant Minjun found her there, and he did not seem surprised to see her hesitating. "The transport is leaving in 10 minutes. He said, "You should be on it." "I know," Yaren replied. "I should be. Because staying serves no tactical purpose, and my death would be a waste of the resources the hegemony invested in my training. And there is nothing I can contribute to the defense that would justify the risk." Minjun nodded. "All of that is true, and yet I find that I cannot make myself walk up that ramp," Yaren said. She looked at him, and she was surprised to find that her voice was steady. "You told me to stay behind you, and I did, and I watched you fight and die for people you had never met. And I think I finally understand why." "Why?" Minjun asked. "Because you are not fighting for victory," Yaren said. "You are fighting for each other, and for the idea that some things matter more than survival, and that is something I want to be part of, even if only for the time I have left." Minjun was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "You do not have to do this. I know," Yaren said. "That is why I want to." Minjun reached out and gripped her shoulder. A gesture she had learned was significant among humans. "Stay behind us," he said for the third time. And this time, she understood what it meant. It was not an order or a warning. It was a promise. The Sketh attacked at midday, and they came in numbers that darkened the horizon. Firebase Echo was a small installation, never meant to withstand a full-scale assault, and the humans defending it numbered less than 200. They should have been swept away in minutes. They held for hours. Siren had taken position in a communications bunker, ostensibly to continue her observations, but when the bunker took a direct hit and half the equipment was destroyed, she found herself helping the wounded instead. She did not know how to fight, but she knew how to carry supplies and apply bandages and speak words of comfort to soldiers who were dying far from home. She watched humans perform acts of courage that defied everything she thought. She knew about sapient behavior. She saw a soldier throw himself onto a Sketh breaching charge, absorbing the explosion with his body so that his squad mates could fall back to secondary positions. She saw medic Yunji, who had not slept in days, drag 3 wounded soldiers to safety while blood poured from a wound in her own side. She saw Captain Kang, who had refused evacuation despite her injuries, directing the defense from a command post that was slowly being reduced to rubble around her. And at the battle's darkest moment, when the Sketh had breached the perimeter and were pouring into the base, Yaren saw something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The humans did not break. They fell back, position by position, fighting for every meter of ground. And even when they were surrounded, even when there was no hope of victory, they kept fighting because they were not fighting to win. They were fighting for the soldiers beside them, for the seconds they could buy, for the chance that somehow, against all odds, help would arrive, and help did arrive. The first hegemony warship appeared in the sky like an answer to a prayer none of them had spoken, and it was followed by another and another, and another word of the human stand had spread across the sector, and species that had never lifted a finger to help the Vetheri had suddenly decided that this fight was worth joining, not because of strategic calculations or political alliances, because they had seen what humans would sacrifice for strangers, and they wanted to be part of it. The Sketh were driven. Backveth 4 with Savvy Dyron was evacuated with the survivors and returned to hegemony space 3 weeks later. Her report still unwritten, the High Council summoned her to present her findings, and she stood before them in the Great Hall where decisions affecting billions of lives were made every day. She looked at their expectant faces, at the data displays and holographic projections that surrounded them. And she set aside her carefully prepared analysis. "I was sent to observe humans in battle," she began, "and I have returned with data that will tell you nothing useful." The council members exchanged confused glances. "I can give you kill ratios and tactical assessments," Yaren continued. "I can tell you that humans are effective combatants, that they fight with determination and ferocity, that they are willing to sustain casualties that would break other species." She paused. "But none of that explains what I witnessed." She told them about Corporal Do Yun Yu, who died to save a private of lesser tactical value. She told them about Medic Unji Cho, who shielded children with her body. She told them about Captain Sujin Kang, who fought with broken legs because her soldiers needed hers. She told them about Sergeant Minjun Park, who smiled at a stranger even when death was certain. "Humans do not fight like other species," she said. "They fight like they are already dead, and like everyone else's life depends on them. And that makes them the most terrifying and the most beautiful warriors I have ever encountered." She looked at the council, at the powerful beings who shaped the fate of the galaxy, and she said the only thing that mattered: they are worth every resource you spend on them, and they are worth following into battle. And if you do not understand that, then you have not been paying attention. 6 months later, Yaren stood in her quarters aboard the Hegemony Research Station and looked at the wall where she had hung a human tradition photographs of the dead Corporal Do Yun. Yu smiled at her from the first frame, and beside him were the faces of all the others who had fallen at Vethfor. Humans she had known for only days, but who had changed everything she understood about what it meant to be alive. Sergeant Minjin had survived, and he sent her messages sometimes, updates on his new posting and questions about her research, and always, the same closing words: "Stay safe." She traced the edges of the photographs with her fingertips and understood at last why humans did this, why they carried their dead with them, why they refused to let go. She had been sent to observe humans in battle, and she wished she had never gone, not because of the horror she had witnessed, though there had been horror beyond imagining, not because of the death. Though death had surrounded her for weeks, she wished she had never gone, because she could never go back to who she had been before she had seen what sapient beings could be at their worst and their best. Inseparable, terrible, and beautiful. She had seen soldiers die for strangers and survivors weep for the feared theirs. Fallen, she had seen courage that defied logic and love that transcended species, and she would carry all of it with her for the rest of her life, just as humans carried their dead. She turned from the photographs and sat down at her desk, where a new assignment waited. The Hegemony wanted her to observe another human deployment, this time in a different sector, and they wanted her analysis of whether the humans' effectiveness could be replicated in other species. She already knew what her answer would be: no. It could not be replicated, because what made humans effective was not their training, or their tactics, or their technology. It was the thing they carried inside them. The capacity for love so fierce it became indistinguishable from war. The willingness to die for the belief that some things mattered more than survival, that could not be taught, that could only be witnessed, and once you witnessed it, you were never the same. Erin picked up her datapad and began to write. "I was sent to observe humans in battle," she typed. "And what I found changed everything I thought I knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it means to be truly alive." She paused, looking at the photographs on her wall one more time. "This is their story," she continued, "and now it is mine as well." She had been sent to observe. She had stayed to fight, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to be worthy of what they had shown her. The field hospital had been established in an abandoned Vethari temple, and its ancient stone walls now echoed with the Sounds of humans suffering walked between the rows of wounded soldiers and tried to maintain the professional detachment that had served her so well. Throughout her career, she failed 3 days had passed since the Battle of Verith Valley, and in that time she had watched humans die from their wounds with words of comfort for their comrades on their lips. She had watched survivors weep for the fallen and then rise to check on soldiers they barely knew. She had watched Medic Yunji work for 30 hours straight, refusing rest, refusing food, refusing everything except the chance to save one more life. The Hegemony Council had ordered her to continue her observations, and so she did. But she found herself unable to maintain the clinical distance that her training demanded. She kept returning to the wounded. Drawn by something she could not name today, she was conducting interviews for her report. And she had started with the soldiers who had been closest to the fighting. Their answers disturbed her in ways she had not anticipated. "Why did you hold the line?" she asked a sergeant named Taiwu, whose left arm ended in a bandaged stump where his hand had been. Taiwu looked at her with eyes that held no anger, only a deep weariness. "Because Ji-hoon was on my left and Su-yang was on my right," he said. "Because if I ran, they would have had to cover my position. And they were already carrying more than they should have. But surely your own survival." Yaren began. "My survival does not matter more than theirs." Taiwu interrupted. "That is not how we work." She interviewed a young woman named Minji who had carried 2 wounded soldiers to safety across 300 meters of open ground while Sketh projectiles screamed past her head. "I do not remember being scared," Minji admitted. "I just remember thinking that they needed help and I could help them. So I did." "You could have died," Yaren pointed out. Minji smiled, and it was a strange smile, full of something Yaren could not identify. "Everyone dies," she said. "Not everyone gets to choose what they die for." Yaren found Private Ji-hoon Lee sitting outside the temple, his wounded shoulder wrapped in clean bandages. Staring at the mountains in the distance, she sat down beside him and waited. "Corporal, you died for me," Ji-hoon said without looking at her. "He threw himself over me and took the round that would have killed me. And now he is dead, and I am alive. And I do not know how to carry that. It seems an inefficient exchange," Yaren said carefully. "He was more experienced than you, more valuable to the unit by any objective measure." Ji-hoon turned to look at her, and there were tears on his face. "That is not why he did it." "Then why?" "Because I would have done the same for him," Ji-hoon said. "Because that is what we are." He wiped his eyes with his good hand and took a shaky breath. "Do-yoon had a daughter back home. Did you know that? She's 4 years old, and she will grow up without her father because he saved me, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. Does that not make you angry?" Yaren asked. "Does it not seem unfair?" Ji-hoon shook his head. "It makes me determined," he said. "It makes me want to be worthy of what he gave. To live a life that means something, so that his sacrifice was not wasted." He looked at her, and there was something fierce in his eyes now. "That is how we honor our dead. Analyst, not with monuments or ceremonies, but by carrying them with us. By becoming better because they believed we were worth saving." Yaren had no response to that. She found Captain Kang awake and lucid despite the severity of her wounds. Propped up on a medical bed, with her shattered legs immobilized in regeneration casts, Captain watched her approach with those cold eyes. But there was something different in them now, something that might have been acceptance. "You have questions," Kang said. "Yes," Yaren admitted. "I have been conducting interviews for my report, but I find that the answers I am receiving do not fit any framework I have for understanding military behavior." "That is because you are using the wrong framework," Kang said. "You are trying to understand us as soldiers, as tactical assets, as resources to be deployed and expended according to strategic calculations. What other framework should I use?" Kang was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than Yaren had ever heard it. "We are not just soldiers," she said. "We are brothers and sisters and children and parents. And we carry all of that with us when we fight." She gestured at the wounded soldiers around them. "Every one of these people has someone waiting for them back home. Someone who loves them. Someone who will grieve if they do not return. That seems like it would make combat more difficult." Yaren observed, "It does." Kang agreed. "It makes it much more difficult. And that is exactly why we are effective." Yaren tilted her head in confusion. "I do not understand. When you fight only for yourself, you will retreat when the odds turn against you, because your own survival is your highest priority," Kang explained. "But when you fight for the people beside you, when you fight for the people waiting at home, when you fight for the idea that some things are worth dying for, then retreat becomes unthinkable." She fixed Yaren with a steady gaze. "We do not fight to survive. Analyst, we fight so that others can survive. And that makes us very dangerous to anyone who stands in our way." Yaren returned to her quarters that evening and reviewed her accumulated data. She had recorded hundreds of hours of footage, thousands of pages of notes, and enough statistical analysis to fill a dozen reports. And it was all useless. The numbers could not capture what she had witnessed. She could document kill ratios and tactical movements, ammunition expenditure, and casualty rates. But none of that explained the thing that made humans. What they were, none of it explained why Do-Yun Yu had died for Ji-Hoon Lee. None of it explained why Medic Yoonji had shielded a stranger's child with her own body. None of it explained why 200 soldiers had stood against an army for 17,000 people. They had never met. She did not have words for it in her language. She was not sure any language had words. For Ida, message arrived from the Hegemony Command. And when Yaren read it, her blood ran cold. A final Sketh offensive was forming, larger than anything they had faced before. The human positions at Firebase Echo would be overrun within hours of the attack beginning. All Hegemony observers were being offered immediate evacuation. Yaren stared at the message for a long time. She thought about Sergeant Minjun, who had smiled at her even when she watched him like a specimen. She thought about Captain Kang, who had fought with broken legs because her soldiers needed Hirsch. She thought about Ji-Hoon Lee, who carried his dead friend's sacrifice like a sacred burden. She thought about what it meant to be worthy of what someone gave. The evacuation transport would leave at dawn. She did not know what to do. The Varith Valley stretched between two mountain ranges like a wound in the earth, and somewhere beyond its far end, 17,000 Vethery civilians were fleeing for their lives. Siren stood on a rocky outcrop beside Captain Kang and watched the Sketh army massing on the valley floor below. There were thousands of them, far more than intelligence had predicted, and their chitinous bodies caught the morning light like a sea of dark shells waiting to crash against the shore. "The Hegemony forces are pulling back," Kang said, lowering her optical scanner. "They have calculated that the defensive position is no longer viable." Yaren checked her datapad and confirmed what Kang had said. The Hegemony tactical AI had analyzed the situation and determined that losses would exceed acceptable thresholds within 2 hours of engagement. Standard doctrine called for a fighting withdrawal to secondary positions, preserving combat strength for future operations. It was the logical choice. It was what any rational military force would do. "Your orders?" Yaren asked. Kang turned and looked at her, and there was something in the captain's eyes that Yaren had never seen before. It was not fear. Though fear would have been reasonable, it was not resignation. Though the tactical situation certainly warranted it, it was something harder and brighter. Something that burned. "We are staying," Kang said. Yaren blinked. "Captain, the tactical analysis clearly indicates." "I know what the analysis indicates," Kang interrupted. I also know that the evacuation convoy is still 6 hours from the safe zone. And if we fall back, the Sketh will pour through this valley and catch them in the open. She pointed toward the distant mountains. 17,000 civilians. Analysts, including children, including elderly, including people who cannot fight and cannot run fast enough to escape what is coming. That is regrettable, Yaren said carefully. But your mission parameters do not include civilian protection. And sacrificing your force for non-strategic objectives would be what? Kang asked, and her voice was quiet but sharp. Illogical? Inefficient? A waste of resources? Yes, Yaren said. All of those things. Kang smiled. And it was not a pleasant expression. Then put that in your report. She walked away to brief her soldiers. And Yaren watched her go with a growing sense that she was missing something fundamental about these humans, something that her training had not prepared her to understand. The battle began an hour later, and it was nothing like the skirmish at FOB. Talon the Sketh came in waves, endless waves, crashing against the human positions like water against stone. The hegemony forces completed their withdrawal within the first 30 minutes. Their transports lifting off in orderly formation. As they fell back to secondary positions, the humans remained. Yaren took shelter in a fortified observation post and recorded everything she saw, her datapad filling with footage and notes that she was increasingly certain would never make it into any official report. She watched humans fight through injuries that would have incapacitated any other species she had studied. She saw a soldier with a broken arm continue firing his weapon one-handed, bracing it against a rock for stability. She saw medic Yoonji Cho sprint across open ground under heavy fire to reach a wounded Vethari civilian who had somehow wandered into the combat zone. And she saw Yoonji use her own body as a shield while she worked to stabilize the patient. The hours stretched on, and the human lines bent but did not break. Soldiers shared their last water with squad mates, passed ammunition to those who had run dry, spoke words of encouragement to those whose courage was faltering. When one soldier fell, another took their position without being ordered. When one position was overrun, the survivors fell back to the next line and kept fighting. Yaren found herself standing beside Sergeant Minjun during a brief lull in the fighting, and she asked him the question that had been burning in her mind since the battle began. Why are you doing this? Minjun was reloading his weapon, his movements automatic and precise. And he did not look at her when he answered. Because someone has to. That is not an answer. Yaren pressed. The hegemony forces withdrew because the tactical situation was untenable. And they were correct to do so. But you are still here. And you are dying for people who are not your species on a world that is not your home. Minjun finally looked at her, and his face was streaked with mud and blood and something else that might have been tears. You really do not understand us at all, he said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a kind of tired sadness. Those people back there, the ones running for the mountains, they are scared, and they are helpless, and they are counting on someone to give them time to escape. He gestured at the soldiers around them. We are someone, but you will die. Yaren said, many of you will die. And for what? A few hours of delay? A symbolic gesture that will be forgotten within a generation. Maybe, Minjun agreed, or maybe one of those children in the convoy will grow up and do something amazing. Something that changes the galaxy. And they will only get that chance because we gave them time today. He shrugged. We will never know. And that is okay, because we are not doing this to be remembered. Then why? Minjan smiled. And even now, even here, there was warmth in it, because it is the right thing to do. The Sketh attacked again before Yaren could respond. And she watched the humans rise to meet them with that same terrible intensity she had witnessed before, but this time she saw something else as well. She saw soldiers pull wounded comrades to safety, even as the Scath closed and she saw a young private, barely older than Ji-Hoon Lee, throw himself onto a Sketh grenade and absorb the blast with his own body so that his squad mates would survive. She saw Captain Kang, both legs shattered by a Sketh projectile. Refuse evacuation and continue. Directing fire from a stretcher while medic. Yoonji tried to stop the bleeding, and then she saw something that her training had no terminology for it all. The humans counterattacked. They were exhausted, wounded, outnumbered by at least 5-1, and they should have been falling back. Should have been conserving their strength for the next defensive position. Instead, they surged forward. They screamed as they charged, a sound that was part rage and part grief and part something else entirely. And the Sketh line, which had been pressing forward with confidence, suddenly wavered. For just a moment, the attackers became the defenders. For just a moment, the impossible became possible, and in that moment, Yaren understood something about humans that she had never grasped from data, files and archived footage. They did not fight because they thought they could win. They fought because they refused to lose. The battle continued until darkness fell, and when the morning light finally reached the valley, the evacuation convoy had reached the safe zone of the 200 human soldiers who had held the pass. 58 remained standing. Yaren sat on a rock beside Captain Kang, who was unconscious now, her wounds finally overwhelming her stubbornness. And she tried to make sense of what she had witnessed. Minjun found her there, his uniform torn and bloodied, his face gray with exhaustion. He sat down beside her without speaking, and for a long moment they simply watched the medics move among the wounded and the dead. "I am sorry," Yaren said finally. "I'm sorry for calling this illogical." Minjun made that sound that humans called a laugh. "Though there was no humor in it, it is illogical," he said. "That is kind of the point." He looked at her, and his eyes were very old. Logic would have let those people die. And we are not willing to be logical about some things. Yaren nodded slowly. "I am beginning to understand." "No," Minjun said gently. "You are beginning to see. But understanding takes longer." He patted her shoulder with a strange tenderness and stood up to help with the wounded. Yaren watched him go and realized that her hands were shaking so badly she could not hold her recording device. She did not try to stop them. Forward operating base Talon was nothing like the military installations Yaren had studied in her years of academic research. Hegemony bases were orderly and efficient, with clear designations and logical layouts that maximized defensive capabilities while minimizing resource expenditure. This place was chaos. Mud covered everything, despite the portable flooring the humans had laid down, and the structures were a haphazard collection of prefabricated shelters and repurposed local building. Soldiers moved between positions without any apparent formation, and the noise was constant. Voices shouting, equipment clanking, and somewhere in the distance, the occasional crack of weapons fire. Irene made notes on her datapad as Minjun led her through the base, documenting the apparent lack of discipline. She observed 2 soldiers were engaged in what appeared to be a physical altercation, shoving each other and laughing, and she recorded this as evidence of poor unit cohesion until Minjun explained they were roughhousing and that it was a form of bonding through simulated violence. She asked, "It seems counterproductive." Minjun shrugged. "It works for us." The command post was located in what had once been a veterinary agricultural storage facility, and inside Yaren met the officer she would be shadowing for the duration of her assignment. Captain Sujin Kang was a small woman, even by human standards, with close-cropped black hair and burn scars that crawled up the left side of her neck and disappeared beneath her uniform collar. Her eyes were the coldest Yaren had ever seen on a human, and when she looked at Yaren, there was no warmth in her gaze at all. "So you are the observer," Kang said, and her voice was flat and hard. The Council wants to know if we are worth the resources they spend on us. I am here to document human military effectiveness. Yaren replied carefully. My report will be objective and comprehensive. Kang made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else entirely. Document whatever you want, she said. Just stay out of my soldiers' way, and do not get any of them killed trying to save you. I have no intention of requiring rescue. Yaren assured her. Kang looked at her for a long moment, and something flickered in those cold eyes. None of them do, she said quietly. And then she turned away to address a logistics report. Tyron spent the next several hours touring the base and interviewing soldiers for background information. She met Private Ji-Hoon Lee, a young man who seemed barely old enough to be in military service. With a quick smile and nervous energy that reminded her of newly hatched Katharish, met Medic Yoonji Cho, a woman with steady hands and tired eyes, who explained the challenges of treating injuries in a forward combat zone. She met Corporal Do-Yun Yu, a quiet soldier who said little but watched everything with an intensity that suggested deep thought behind his silence. They were all unfailingly polite to her, even friendly, and yet she could not shake the feeling that they were keeping something from her, some knowledge that they shared among themselves, but could not or would not explain to an outsider. The Sketh attacked at Sunset. Yurin was in the mess tent reviewing her notes when the first alarm sounded, and within seconds, the camp transformed from apparent chaos into something else entirely. Soldiers who had been laughing and eating moments before now moved with purpose, weapons appearing in hands, positions being taken along the perimeter. Minjun found her and pulled her toward a reinforced shelter. Stay here, he ordered. Do not come out until someone comes for you. Through the shelter's narrow viewport, Yaren watched her first human combat engagement, and nothing in her training had prepared her for what she saw. The Sketh came in fast, their chitinous bodies scuttling across the broken terrain with terrifying speed. And the humans met them with a wall of fire that should have been beautiful in its precision, but there was nothing precise about it. Humans fought like cornered animals, with a desperation and ferocity that went far beyond what the tactical situation required. They screamed as they fired, wordless sounds of rage and defiance, and when the Sketh breached the perimeter in 3 places, the humans did not fall back as doctrine would suggest. They pushed forward. Yurin watched a soldier take a wound that should have dropped him, a deep gash across his thigh that sprayed blood with every heartbeat. And instead of seeking medical attention, he kept firing until 2 of his squad mates physically dragged him to cover. She watched Captain Kang walk calmly through the chaos, directing fire and repositioning troops as if the death screaming around her was merely an inconvenience. She watched something that made no sense at all. Private Ji-Hoon Lee went down in the eastern sector, hit by a Sketh projectile that punched through his shoulder and sent him sprawling in the mud. Standard protocol for any species Yaren had studied was clear. Wounded soldiers in active combat zones were retrieved by medical drones or waited until the engagement concluded. 3 humans broke cover and ran toward him. Corporal Do-Yun reached him first, throwing himself over Ji-Hoon's body as another Sketh projectile screamed past. 2 others, soldiers whose names Yaren did not know, grabbed Ji-Hoon's arms and began dragging him back toward the medical station while Do-Hyun provided covering fire. A Sketh round took Do-Hyun in the chest. He fell without a sound, and the mud beneath him turned dark with blood. The other 2 soldiers did not stop. They kept dragging Ji-Hoon to safety, and only when he was behind cover did one of them go back for Do-Hyun's body, not to save him because he was clearly dead, but to retrieve him, to bring him home. The engagement lasted another 20 minutes, and when it was over, the Sketh had been repelled with significant losses on both sides. Cyrene emerged from the shelter on shaking legs and found herself standing at the edge of a scene that her analytical mind could not process, the humans were gathered around Doyin's body. Someone had closed his eyes and crossed his arms over his chest. And the soldiers around him were not maintaining tactical awareness or securing the perimeter or doing any of the things that military protocol demanded. They were crying hardened soldiers. Warriors who had just killed without hesitation stood with tears running down their faces as they looked at their fallen comrade. One of them held Do-Yoon's hand and spoke to him softly, words Yaren could not hear, as if the dead man could somehow still listen. Captain Kang stood apart from the group, her face expressionless, but Yaren noticed that her hands were trembling. When Kang saw Yaren watching, she walked over and stood beside her. "Write that down in your report," Kang said, and her voice was rough, with something that was not quite anger. "Write that we remember every single one." "I do not understand," Yaren admitted. "He died to save one soldier of equal or lesser tactical value, and 3 others risked their lives to retrieve a body that had no strategic importance." Kang looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "You do not understand." She walked away without explaining, and Yaren was left standing alone as the humans sang low songs for their dead, and the smoke rose into the darkening sky that night. Yaren lay awake in her assigned quarters and listened to the sounds of the camp around her. She could hear voices murmuring, could hear someone weeping softly in a nearby shelter, could hear the humans doing something that defied every model of efficient military behavior she had ever studied. For the first time in her career, her analytical detachment felt like a failing rather than a strength. She did not sleep at all. Yaren Talvos had spent her entire career studying war from the safety of data streams and archived footage, and she had never once felt the need to witness combat in person until the day the Hegemony Council decided she would embed with human forces on VEF 4. The orders arrived on a quiet morning aboard the orbital station, delivered by a junior officer who seemed almost apologetic about the assignment. "The Council wants comprehensive documentation of human military effectiveness," High Analyst Dowan Relmith explained as he handed her the mission briefing, his 4 eyes blinking in that slow pattern that indicated mild concern among their Kindurans. Scrolled through the briefing on her datapad and found herself intrigued. Despite her reservations, humans were relatively new to the galactic stage, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 3 generations ago, and their military capabilities remain poorly documented in hegemony archives. "What do we know about them so far?" Shieskadon made a dismissive gesture with his upper arms. "They are small, short-lived, emotionally volatile, and they come from a Category 7 death world," he said, as if these facts explained everything worth knowing. "Their planet has extreme temperature variations, active tectonic activity, a magnetic field that barely protects them from their own sun, and they evolved alongside predators that should have driven them to extinction." He paused and added with what might have been amusement, "They also appear to form intense social bonds with nearly anything, including inanimate objects and species that would happily eat them." Yaren found this last detail oddly fascinating. She spent the next several hours reviewing all available data on humanity, and what she found painted a strange picture. Their evolutionary history revealed them to be persistence hunters, creatures who chase their prey across vast distances until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. They slept for a third of their short lives, but could also function for extended periods without rest when necessary. They consumed a bewildering variety of substances that would poison most species, including a mild neurotoxin called caffeine that they ingested daily and sometimes multiple times per day. Most curious of all was their documented tendency to form what they called bonds with other beings. These bonds apparently created obligations that humans would honor, even at great personal cost. a behavior that seemed inefficient at best and self-destructive. At worst, Yarin made careful notes and prepared herself for an interesting academic experience, the transport vessel that would carry her to HFY was a human ship called the Steady Horizon, and she noticed immediately that it smelled different from hegemony vessels. There was something organic about the scent, something alive, though she could not identify its source. A human male met her at the airlock, and her first impression was that he was smaller than she had expected. He stood perhaps 2/3 her height, with dark hair and warm brown skin, and when he smiled at her, he showed his teeth in what she knew intellectually was a greeting, but which her instincts registered as a threat display. "Analyst Talvos?" he asked, and his voice was surprisingly pleasant. "I am Sergeant Minjun Park, and I will be your liaison during this deployment." "I appreciate the assistance," Yarin replied, keeping her tone professionally neutral. "I hope my presence will not interfere with your operations." Minjun made a sound that she would later learn was called a laugh. "You will be fine," he said, and there was something in his expression that she could not read. "Just stay close to us and you will be safe." The transport hummed around them as it began its descent toward HFY, and Yarin moved to the viewport to observe their approach. What she saw made her pause. The planet below was burning. Great columns of smoke rose from what had once been cities, and she could see the flash of weapons fire even from this altitude. The Sketh Dominion had invaded 3 weeks ago, and the hegemony had responded by deploying a coalition force that included these humans. "It is worse than the briefings indicated," she observed. Minjun joined her at the viewport, and she noticed that his expression had changed. The easy warmth was gone, replaced by something harder and more focused. "The Sketh do not believe in restraint," he said quietly. "They see other species as resources to be consumed or obstacles to be removed. And the Vethari civilians down there are learning that lesson the hard way." Yarin studied his face with professional interest. "You seem personally affected by this," she noted. "The Vethari are not your species, and this is not your world." Minjun turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that her training had no framework for. "No," he agreed. "They are not my species, and this is not my world." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was very soft. "But they are people, and they are suffering, and we are here." He said this as if it explained everything, and Yarin found herself making a mental note to explore this peculiar reasoning further. The transport shuddered as it entered the atmosphere, and warning lights flickered briefly before stabilizing through the viewport. The burning landscape grew closer, and Yarin could now make out individual structures amid the devastation. Some were still standing, others were nothing but rubble, and between them moved tiny figures that might have been soldiers or civilians or corpses. "Analyst," Minjun said, and his voice had taken on a formal quality. "I need to tell you something before we land." Yarin turned her attention from the viewport. "Yes?" "When we reach the ground, things may become dangerous very quickly," he said. "The Sketh are aggressive, and they do not distinguish between combatants and observers." "I understand," Yarin replied. "I have reviewed the tactical assessments, and I'm prepared for—" "No," Minjun interrupted, and there was no apology in his voice for the breach of protocol. "You are not prepared because you have never seen what we do, and you have never seen what we face." He held her gaze with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Stay behind us," he said. "No matter what happens, no matter what you see, stay behind us and let us do what we came here to do." Yarin wanted to argue, wanted to point out that she had observed 17 species in conflict, scenarios via remote feed, and that she was more than qualified to handle whatever awaited them below, but something in his expression stopped her. "I will stay behind." "You," she agreed. Minjun nodded once, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "Good," he said. "An analyst?" Yes, if everything goes wrong, if we tell you to run. You run, he said. Do not look back, do not try to help. Just run and do not stop until you reach friendly lines. That seems unnecessarily dramatic. Yaren observed Minjin smiled again. But this time, the expression did not reach his eyes. I hope you are right, he said. I hope this whole deployment is boring and uneventful, and you go home with nothing interesting to report. The transport touched down with a heavy thump, and the rear doors began to open, letting in the smell of smoke and something else that Yaren would later learn was the scent of death. Minjun checked his weapon and moved toward the exit. Welcome to Veth 4, he said over his shoulder and gathered her recording equipment and followed him into the burning world below. Confident in her training and her professional detachment, she had observed war before. After all, she had analyzed battles and documented casualties and written reports that influenced strategic decisions at the highest levels. She was prepared for this. She was certain of it.